This is for September the 9th, 2020. This is the last couple of slides for Lesson 4. Well, we had talked yesterday about the fact that there were no public schools, that the only schools there were those who were run by the church. Now we're going to find an abundance of schools in New England because the population is so dense. And in certain middle colonies, we're going to find large concentration of schools because, again, the population is dense. But in the South, because the people are so spread out, the homes of the planters will become the site of the schools. Children are taught the basics. Now, we are talking no more than, say, a third grade education. They're taught to read the Bible. They're taught to do enough math to do ciphers. They're taught to write their own name. Now, this is an idea of some of the things a child might learn at school during this time period. There was no higher education to speak of. If you wanted to go beyond the normal third grade, you would be going to a school in which you would be learning to become a minister of the faith that you are a member of. Now, we put in our notes back in Lesson 3 that Harvard was the first college to be built in the colonies. There were many, many more, though, that came afterwards. Yale probably came second. It was done in Connecticut. Brown was constructed in Rhode Island, Penn in Pennsylvania, Columbia in New York, and William and Mary in Virginia. Again, all of these colleges were established so that young men could go and learn about being a minister in the faith that they are part of. In the 17th century, that would be the 1600s, most people did not survive on their arrival to the colonies. The death toll was horrendous. There was an economic downturn in Great Britain. There were civil wars and wars to get rid of the king in England. And it's because of this that the colonies were inundated with indentured servants. But by the time we get to the 18th century, the 1700s, politically and economically conditions are much better in England. The indentured servants are less popular. People of the countries came to the colonies and the land became more diversified. So not only do we have English coming to the colonies, but we also have people from other countries, particularly Germans. In the South, because of the lack of cities, special commercial farms were developed. These commercial farms were called plantation. Now, the plantation was built around cheap labor, mostly slave labor. The next short video deals with life on the plantation. In the middle colonies, large farms were built near rivers. Now, these farms required cheap labor, and in the 18th century, that would be the 1700s, a lot of times immigrants who had just come to America would work for very, very small wages. This is where the middle colonies got most of their workers. So the South was slave, and the middle was cheap labor. The colonies, the workforce was scarce. People would sell themselves for indentured servants. People from many countries would take this route to the colonies. So just because life in Great Britain is getting better doesn't mean life is getting better in other parts of Europe. And so we see a lot of Germans, we see a lot of French coming to this area. Slaves were also brought in. Now, a slave would serve for a master for the slave's life, and servitude would be passed on from generation to generation. Some colonies did not allow slaves to purchase their freedom or to be released by the master. Some colonies did allow a slave to be set free in the wills. It's on a colony by colony basis as to what will happen to the slaves. All colonies except Pennsylvania had what were called slave codes. Now, the slave codes applied to the slaves and were an attempt to deny them basic human rights. A slave could not decide who a slave wanted to marry. The master could get rid of the slave's children and sell them off for a high price. Slave families could be busted up. Slaves could be abused or sexually molested. It was a terrible, terrible time. Now, these slave codes referred to the Negro slaves as chattel. Now, I think chattel is a term that needs to go into your term sheet. And we're going to continue to call slaves chattel until the time of the American Civil War. Again, it is important to remind yourself in your notes that slaves had no rights. Slaves were treated like animals. In the larger cities where industries could form, a new type of worker was created. Now, if you were a young man, and sorry ladies, but you would have to be a young man, you could go to a master craftsman and you could learn his job. You would be called an apprentice. Now, normally your parents would have to sign a piece of paper and you would work for the master craftsman for a set number of years, and after these years you would demonstrate that you have the skill, and then you could become a journeyman. Now, an apprentice would receive an education. The apprentice would be given a place to sleep. An apprentice would be given food, and all of this would come from the master craftsman. After the apprentice had served his time, then he would journey from city to city perfecting his craft, and maybe someday he would become a master craftsman. By the early 1700s, the Crown had begun to create laws to regulate commerce. Now, generally, these laws are called Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts were an attempt to end triangle trade. Now, remember, we heard in the video yesterday that triangle trade was very profitable, and so many people in the colonies resisted these Navigation Acts, and in some cases refused to comply. Parliament imposed a list of prohibited goods. These are called enumerated goods. Enumerated goods could only be sold in the colonies. So let's say that you are a British tax collector and you go to the colonies and you notice that a particular colonist is selling a good that is not made in Great Britain. The person who is selling it could be arrested, thrown in jail, fined, or both. Enumerated goods are goods that are established to protect British businesses. The Parliament is going to establish what is called the Privy Council. Now, the Privy Council is a group of wealthy businessmen. They are lords who are in the aristocracy, and they advise the crown concerning the colonies. Now, the Privy Council was actually part of the king's domain. The king could talk to the Privy Council and then go to Parliament. But a lot of times the Privy Council was made up of parliamentary members. And so you have both groups working together. The Crown established laws that pertain to non-English actions. So the Crown decided to try to curtail the number of immigrants coming into the British colonies. We're going to end today with the Zinger trial. John Zinger was a newspaper publisher in the colony of New York. Now, Zinger had written some articles that were extremely critical of the royal governor, and the royal governor had Zinger arrested. Zinger suggested that his trial be held in New York, and that the people who made up his jury should be New Yorkers. Zinger asked for a trial by a jury of his peers. This is something that comes out of English common law. The jury met, and the jury decided that Zinger was not guilty. This is the first time in which a colonist will ask for a trial with a jury of his own peers. Lesson 5 is going to begin with 1750. And in 1750, the French and British are going to develop what are called the 7 Years' War. Now, here in America, the 7 Years' War are called the French and Indian War. And that's where we'll pick it up next week.